Hi, and welcome to Inside the Creative Mind. I'm your host, William Saunders. And today I got something really special I want to talk to you about. And it's something that I personally have been experiencing for quite some time now. And if you are a creative type or you know somebody who's a creative type that has dealt with or is dealing with creative paralysis, then this video is really for you. And so I want to start by kind of just talking a little bit about what is creative paralysis. And it really boils down to the inability to make progress or to finish projects that is of a creative nature. And, for myself, this manifests as my inability to finish a piece of artwork or my inability to finish any type of music or creative projects that I'm working on. And this can stem from a bunch of different ways of reasons why creative paralysis can set in. One of them is the fear of failure. And it can be overwhelming at times, where you just feel like you're just not good enough to really be doing something. I've dealt with that in the past. It's not something that I would deal with now because I've had enough time and enough success that I feel like, oh, I can do these things. Then another one is perfectionism. And I feel like a lot of people probably deal with this because one of the questions I ask my guest on Inside the Creative Mind is, how do you know when something is complete? And I find it fascinating, the wide array of answers I've gotten from that question, because sometimes it's hard to just say enough is enough because you want everything to be perfect. And so perfectionism can be something that gets in the way of completing your work. And it's just best to figure out, before I even start, how can I label this as complete? When will I know when it's done? If you can think of that at the outset, sometimes I'll make it easier for you to kind of navigate that. Another one is self-doubt. And, a lot of times it's easy to get sucked into this window of, questioning your own capabilities. And I'll tell you what, social media does not help this at all. For example, I don't really feel this in the musical space as much as I do in the visual art space. Being on social media in particular with, Instagram or Facebook or Twitter or X or, anything that you find where there's artists that are posting their artwork at, it can be just daunting. There's a number of artists that I follow on Facebook that are just amazing. And at times it'll make me feel like, why even bother? Because, I'm not that good, but I think once you settle into your own style and your own way of doing things, I think some of that goes to the wayside. Another one is feeling overwhelmed. And this is more in line with kind of what I've had to deal with here in the recent history here. And sometimes that overwhelmness can be just life being too hard to tackle. And sometimes it's just the project is too large. And so you've, bitten off more than you can chew, per se. And another one is this learned helplessness. When you have repeated setbacks and systematic barriers that make you feel like you're powerless to succeed, those things can be a self-fulfilling prophecy if you buy into them too much. So there's ways that we can deal with this to try to overcome some of these things. So how do you deal with this? Well, one thing you can do is shift your perspective. Reframe your obstacles as opportunities and view mistakes as stepping stones rather than failures is a big one. Start small, break projects into manageable little chunks that you can check off and make progress that way. Another one is, establishing some creative rituals, dedicate consistent time to work on stuff, even if it's very brief, and then, create an inspiring work space for yourself. If you have clutter and stuff that prevents you from really being able to utilize your space, deal with that first. And then another one is embracing imperfection. Not everything has to be perfect. It really doesn't. And a lot of times, I've had, semi-finished pieces of work that people have wanted, artistically, that, I was like, oh man, this is nowhere near ready, but they wanted to buy it just as it was at that moment. And I wasn't even finished with it technically, so just imperfections, embracing those, not everything do you do is going to be, a 10, sometimes it's okay to knock out an 8 or a 9 or a 7, just let it be what it is. Then mindfulness and mental clarity, things like short walks and meditation and just the ability to get inside your own head and just reduce the mental clutter that's inside your mind will sometimes allow you to break through with that. And then, another one is community and feedback. If you have, a support group, of friends and stuff like that, a lot of times when I post something, on Facebook and where I'm, say I'm struggling with something, I get a ton of support from just people that are, my acquaintances and friends on Facebook. And it does help me. It does help me to realize that, I'm not in this alone, and I can overcome whatever comes my way. And another one is self-compassion. Recognize that the creative paralysis is it's common, and with patience you can overcome it. And then another one that you can do is to focus on abundance, not scarcity. Believe that the ideas and opportunities are plentiful, reducing the pressure that fuels the paralysis. So those are just a couple of key things. But now I want to take you into what exactly I've been dealing with. So if you're familiar with the hierarchy of needs, it basically states that, there are some, housing, food, shelter, those type things take precedent over, you know, nice to have type things, that, are in art, in the creative process is one of those things that falls far behind, in making sure you can actually eat. So long story short, I was laid off back in October, and it just so happened to be a very bad time to be laid off because the job market was and is very challenging at this point in time. And then there's some things I just failed to just even think about. One was that the last time I really looked for a job with with some level of having to do it kind of on a full-time basis was about a decade ago. So I'm a decade older, so I'm competing with people that are, much younger than I am for the same kind of jobs. And then the second thing is I've got an old arm injury that, prevents me from doing a lot of really heavy physical labor. I got a torn disc in my lower back, and I just simply can't do some of the work I would have done 10 years ago, 15 years ago. So I'm kind of narrowed in my path of jobs that I was, looking to be able to do. So, but when you've got that pressure of how am I going to pay rent? How am I going to eat today? It takes precedence over everything. So the paralysis I was feeling was really centered around, I don't have time to even think about anything creative because I got all my energy into how am I going to survive? And I can, I just call it survival mode. And I feel like, being a full-time musician or a full-time artist is such a privilege when you can dedicate 100% of your time that would be normally to a job or whatever, and dedicate it to your passion. It's just magical. I had so much growth over a period of time, from 2009 to 2014, excuse me. During that time frame, I was able to focus on music pretty much, 24/7. And it's all I was doing was music. And my growth was just amazing. When I look at that period and I look at some of the work I did during that period, it blows my mind. It's sometimes hard for me to even relate to that because I do not get that same amount of time at all to dedicate to any of that. And the same thing applies to art. I was doing far more pieces, back then than I am now. So survival mode is something that, takes precedence. It just does. And I ended up, for, a number of months, doing DoorDash. And I can tell you, if you've ever had to do this, you cannot make a living wage off of DoorDash. I mean, you probably could if you wanted to work 10, 12 hours a day doing it, but the amount of, money you have to dump in the gas and everything else, it just really wasn't worth it. And, I wasn't in any way, shape, or form meeting all my bills. So, and a lot of that really caught up to me. So, but I did manage to find a job. I did manage to find some employment, and it's amazing that cloud lifted off of me and what it did for my ability to kind of just dive back in. So, I've got a number of songs that I'm going to be publishing here, really soon, that I just had sitting on a shelf. I wasn't able to do anything with them because I just could never get around to it. I have episodes of Inside the Creative Mind I need to finish the edit job and get those posted out there because they're sitting there waiting on me. It just, I physically could not get around to getting those projects done. Seriously, the door dashing took everything out of me. I don't think I had a day off from November through June. So I worked every single day because I had to. If I want to eat that day, you better work that day, kind of a thing. So it was crazy, but I'm glad that it's a little bit in the rearview mirror, and you got to march forward. You got to do what you got to do. So if you are experiencing some form of creative paralysis, all I'm going to say is hang in there. If you're dealing with something like I was dealing with, where you're in survival mode, just find your way out first. Don't worry about, what you're missing from the creative aspect. It does feed your soul. So if you can work it in, that's great. But, obviously you got to take care of your own business and handle your own, stuff in your own house before you can really tackle, something like that. So hopefully you get back to doing your passion and your love. I'm grateful every day to be able to do any of the things I'm able to do creatively. So, yeah, that's the message I got for you. Hang in there and get to busy doing something fun and creative. Anyway, love y'all. Peace.